January 28th, 2026. Crestview Heights, Westchester County, New York. 17-year-old Julian Alexander Vane sat at the defense table with the poise of a chief executive officer attending a quarterly earnings call. For Julian, this was not justice. It was an act. Clad in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, he maintained the persona of a grieving genius whose best friend had perished in a freak household accident. He believed he was the smartest person in the room, smarter than the jury, the police, and the grieving parents sitting 10 feet away. While the initial charge of involuntary manslaughter felt like a minor hurdle to him, the contradiction between his accident story and the physical reality was growing. He leaned back, occasionally scoffing at the prosecution's clumsy attempts to build a case. But Julian's intellectual vanity had left a digital footprint. A single forensic digital log would destroy everything. As he prepared to deliver his final smug smirk to the cameras, he had no idea that his own search history was about to testify against him. By the time the judge spoke his name for the last time, the performance would be over. The Westchester County Courthouse stood as a monument to old money and older traditions, its limestone facade glowing pale in the winter morning light. Inside, Courtroom 7 had been prepared for what local news outlets were already calling the trial of the decade. The arraignment had drawn a massive crowd. Reporters jostled for position in the media pool. Curious citizens lined the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse of the teenage defendant who had become an overnight sensation. Julian entered the courtroom, flanked by 2 bailiffs. But he walked with his head high, his expression carefully neutral. He was not yet wearing the orange jumpsuit with white undershirt that would become his uniform during the trial. For the arraignment, his expensive legal team had successfully argued he could appear in civilian clothes. He wore the charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt and a burgundy tie, his dark hair swept back in a style that suggested preparation and care. He looked every inch the Ivy League-bound scholar, not a killer. Judge Catherine Sterling presided over the arraignment. She was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had a reputation for running a tight courtroom and tolerating zero nonsense. As Julian stood before her, she reviewed the charging documents with meticulous attention. The prosecutor, Daniel Martinez, stood to present the charges. Daniel was 42 years old, a veteran of the Westchester County District Attorney's Office with a track record that spoke for itself. 23 murder convictions in 15 years. 0 losses. He was a compact man with dark hair graying at the temples and a quiet intensity that made witnesses nervous and defendants terrified. "Your Honor," Daniel began, his voice steady and clear, "the people charge Julian Alexander Vane with involuntary manslaughter in the death of Leo Christopher Hayes. On January 15th of this year, the defendant was present in the home of the victim when the victim sustained fatal injuries. The defendant claims these injuries were the result of an accidental fall. The evidence will show otherwise." Julian's defense attorney, Robert Caldwell, rose immediately. Robert was 61, a lion of the New York Criminal Defense Bar, with a mane of white hair and a voice trained in the theater before he turned to law. He had defended senators, hedge fund managers, and heirs to industrial fortunes. He did not lose cases. "Your Honor," My client is a 17-year-old honors student with no criminal record, no history of violence, and a lifetime of academic and personal achievement ahead of him. The tragic death of Leo Hayes was an accident, a horrible, traumatic accident that my client witnessed and desperately tried to prevent. The people's rush to criminalize grief is both premature and unconscionable. Judge Sterling looked from Robert to Daniel, then down to Julian. Mr. Vane, you are charged with involuntary manslaughter. How do you plead? Julian stood. He took a moment, letting the silence build, ensuring every eye in the courtroom was on him. When he spoke, his voice was clear, articulate, and completely calm. Not guilty, Your Honor. Absolutely not guilty. As he sat down, Judge Sterling began explaining the procedural timeline for the case. She was in the middle of setting the preliminary hearing date when Julian leaned forward slightly and spoke, his voice carrying across the quiet courtroom. Your Honor, if I may, I believe you mispronounced habeas corpus. The correct Latin pronunciation uses a hard C, not the anglicized soft C. The courtroom went silent. Every person turned to stare at Julian. Judge Sterling's eyes narrowed dangerously. Robert Caldwell closed his eyes in barely concealed horror. Excuse me, Mr. Vane. Julian, seemingly oblivious to the shock he had caused, continued. It's a common mistake. Many American courts use the anglicized pronunciation, but classical Latin scholars agree that the hard C is more authentic. I just thought, in the interest of precision, it was worth noting. Judge Sterling stared at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was ice. Mr. Vane, in my courtroom, you will speak only when spoken to. You will address me with respect, and you will not, under any circumstances, presume to lecture me on matters of law, language, or anything else. Do I make myself clear? Julian blinked, a flicker of irritation crossing his features before he smoothed it away. Of course, Your Honor. My apologies. But the damage was done. Every juror in the selection pool, every reporter in the room, every member of Leo's family had just witnessed Julian's arrogance. They had seen him correct a judge during his own arraignment, treating the proceeding like a classroom where he was the professor. The arraignment concluded with the setting of a trial date 3 weeks away. Julian was released on a $2 million bond, posted immediately by his father. As he walked out of the courtroom, he paused to adjust his tie in the reflection of a glass partition, then offered a small, brave smile toward the media cameras. The image would be on the evening news within hours. The investigation had begun 2 weeks earlier, in the cold pre-dawn hours of January 16th. Detective Sarah Vance, no relation to the defendant, had been roused from sleep by the call. A teenage boy was dead. Suspicious circumstances. She had dressed quickly, kissed her sleeping wife, and driven through empty streets to the address in Crestview Heights. The house belonged to the Hayes family. It was a large colonial-style home on 2 acres, set back from the road behind mature trees. When Sarah arrived, the scene was already secured. Patrol officers had responded to a 911 call and found Leo Hayes, age 17, dead at the bottom of the basement stairs. The caller had been Julian Vane, Leo's best friend. Sarah entered through the front door and was directed to the basement by a uniformed officer. She descended the stairs carefully, her eyes taking in every detail. The basement was finished, with cream-colored carpet and recessed lighting. At the bottom of the stairs, Leo's body lay crumpled against the wall. He was wearing jeans and a Crestview Academy sweatshirt. His head was turned at an unnatural angle. The medical examiner, Dr. Philip Chen, was already examining the body. Sarah waited until he looked up and nodded before approaching. "What do we have, Phil?" Dr. Chen stood, peeling off his latex gloves. Male, approximately 17 years old. Massive trauma to the cervical spine. His neck is broken. There's also significant bruising around the throat and contusions on the back of the head, consistent with impact against a hard surface. Sarah looked at the stairs, then back at the body. Consistent with a fall? Maybe, but there are some inconsistencies. The bruising around the throat is troubling. It's patterned, almost like finger marks. And the way he landed doesn't quite match a simple fall. I'll know more after the autopsy. Sarah nodded and began photographing the scene. She documented the position of the body, the stairs, the surrounding area. She noted a small wet spot on one of the middle steps, just a trace of moisture that might have been spilled water or another liquid. She photographed it from multiple angles. Upstairs, in the kitchen, Julian Vane sat at the table with a blanket around his shoulders, talking to a patrol officer. Sarah watched him through the doorway for a moment before approaching. He was eerily calm, his voice steady as he described what had happened. "We were making dinner together. Leo's parents are in Boston for the week, and I came over to keep him company. We were cooking pasta. Leo went downstairs to get a bottle of wine from the storage area. I heard a crash and a thud. I ran down and found him at the bottom of the stairs. I tried to check his pulse, but he wasn't breathing. I called 911 immediately." Sarah sat down across from him. "What time did you arrive at the house, Julian?" "Around 6:30. "And what time did Leo go downstairs?" "Maybe 7:15. I'm not exactly sure." "Did you see him fall?" "No. I was in the kitchen, stirring the sauce." Sarah made notes. Julian's story was plausible, but something felt wrong. His affect was too flat. He was describing the death of his best friend with the emotional engagement of someone reading a grocery list. "Julian, I need to ask you something. When you found Leo, did you touch him? Move him at all?" "I checked for a pulse. I put my hand on his neck." "Did you notice anything unusual? Any injuries that seemed inconsistent with the fall?" Julian's eyes sharpened slightly. "Are you suggesting this wasn't an accident, Detective?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm gathering information." Julian leaned back in his chair, and for just a moment, Sarah saw something flicker across his face. It was not grief. It was not fear. It was irritation. "I've told you what happened. Leo fell. I tried to save him. I failed. If you're implying something else, you're wasting your time." Sarah held his gaze. "I'm just doing my job, Julian." The search of the Hayes residence took 6 hours. The forensics team photographed every room, collected samples, and documented everything. They found the pasta sauce still simmering on the stove. They found 2 wine glasses on the counter, one with a trace of red wine, one empty. They found Leo's phone on the kitchen island, and when they tried to access it, they discovered it had been wiped. Factory reset. All data erased. Sarah bagged the phone as evidence. Why would Leo's phone be wiped? Who had access to it after his death? The questions multiplied. 48 hours later, Sarah obtained a warrant to search Julian's residence. The Vane family lived in an even larger estate, a sprawling Tudor-style mansion with a circular driveway and professionally landscaped grounds. Julian's father, Alexander Vane, was the chief financial officer of a major pharmaceutical company. His mother, Patricia, sat on the boards of 3 different charities. They were Westchester royalty. When Sarah arrived with the search team, Patricia Vane answered the door in yoga attire, her expression a mix of shock and indignation. "This is outrageous. Julian has done nothing wrong." Sarah handed her the warrant. "We have authorization to search Julian's bedroom and personal electronics. Please step aside." Julian's room was on the 2nd floor, a large space with a 4-poster bed, a mahogany desk, and built-in bookshelves lined with classics and academic texts. Sarah noticed immediately that the room was almost obsessively organized. Books arranged by height, desk supplies in perfect right angles, not a single item out of place. The forensics tech, a young woman named Emily Rodriguez, began photographing the room. Sarah went to the desk. On it sat a closed MacBook Pro, school-issued, with a Crestview Academy sticker on the lid. Sarah opened it. The screen showed the setup wizard. The laptop had been factory reset. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. 2 devices, both factory reset within days of Leo's death. That was not a coincidence. "Emily, bag this laptop. I want our digital forensics team to go through it with a microscope." Julian was brought in for formal questioning 3 days later. The interrogation room at the Westchester County Police Department was deliberately unremarkable. Beige walls and a metal table bolted to the floor. Sarah sat across from Julian with her partner, Detective Marcus Webb. Julian had his lawyer present, Robert Caldwell, who had already made it clear that his client would not be answering questions. Sarah began anyway. "Julian, why did you factory reset your school laptop?" Robert held up a hand. "Don't answer that." "Julian, why was Leo's phone wiped clean?" "Don't answer." "Julian, do you know what the penalty is for obstruction of justice?" Robert stood. "Detective, unless you're charging my client with a crime, this interview is over." Sarah leaned back. "Actually, Mr. Caldwell, we are. Julian Alexander Vane, you are under arrest for the murder of Leo Christopher Hayes." Julian's face remained impassive, but Sarah saw his hands clench briefly under the table. "This is absurd." The arrest made national news. The image of Julian being led out of the police station in handcuffs, his face composed and emotionless, went viral within hours. The narrative took shape immediately. Genius student accused of murdering his best friend. Wealthy family. High-powered lawyers. It had all the elements of a media sensation. The trial began on a grey February morning. The courtroom was packed. Julian sat at the defense table in the orange jumpsuit with white undershirt that all defendants wore during trial. But somehow he still managed to project an air of superiority. He sat with perfect posture, occasionally making notes on a legal pad in neat, precise handwriting. Daniel Martinez stood to deliver his opening statement. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, no flash, no theatrics. He walked to the jury box, and looked at each of the 12 jurors in turn. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about intelligence used for evil. Julian Vane is, by all accounts, a brilliant young man. Perfect grades, perfect test scores, accepted to Princeton. But he is also a killer. On January 15th, he murdered his best friend Leo Hayes in a carefully planned and coldly executed act of violence. He researched how to do it. He planned when to do it. He created a cover story, and then he did it. The evidence will show you exactly how he did it, and more importantly, it will show you that he knew exactly what he was doing every step of the way. This was not an accident. This was murder. Robert Caldwell's opening statement was theatrical by comparison. He paced before the jury, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm. The prosecution wants you to believe that Julian Vane, a 17-year-old boy with no history of violence, no criminal record, and a lifetime of achievement, suddenly decided to murder his best friend. Why? They'll struggle to tell you. Because there is no why. Because it didn't happen. What happened was a tragedy. Leo Hayes, a young man in the prime of his life, fell down a flight of stairs and died. Julian then tried to save him. Julian called for help. Julian has to live with the trauma of watching his friend die. And now the state wants to compound that trauma by accusing him of murder. It's not just wrong, it's cruel. The first witness was Leo's father, David Hayes. He was a man in his early 50s, with graying hair and the shell-shocked expression of a parent who had lost a child. Daniel handled him gently. "Mr. Hayes, can you tell us about your son?" David's voice was rough with emotion. "Leo was everything to us. He was kind. He was smart. He wanted to be a doctor. He spent his weekends volunteering at the animal shelter. He was just a good kid." "When did you last see Leo alive?" "January 14th. My wife and I were leaving for Boston. We had a medical conference. Leo said he'd be fine on his own. We kissed him goodbye." David's voice broke. "We never saw him alive again." The courtroom was silent. Even Julian had the sense to look down at his notes rather than meet David Hayes's eyes. Daniel introduced the crime scene photos. They were projected onto a large screen facing the jury. Leo's body at the bottom of the stairs, the bruising on his neck, the unnatural angle of his head. Several jurors looked away. The medical examiner, Dr. Philip Chen, took the stand. Daniel walked him through the autopsy findings in careful detail. "Dr. Chen, you performed the autopsy on Leo Hayes. Can you describe your findings?" "The cause of death was a fracture of the second and third cervical vertebrae, commonly known as a broken neck. This injury severed the spinal cord and caused immediate death." "Is this injury consistent with a fall downstairs?" Dr. Chen hesitated. "It can be. However, there were other findings that gave me pause. The bruising around the throat was significant. I found petechiae, small burst blood vessels, in the eyes. These are typically associated with strangulation or compression of the neck." "Could these injuries have been caused by a fall?" "It's possible, but unlikely. The pattern of the bruising suggested sustained pressure, not the brief impact you'd expect from a fall." Robert's cross-examination was aggressive. "Dr. Chen, you said it's possible these injuries were caused by a fall, correct?" "Yes." So you cannot rule out the possibility that this was an accident? I cannot rule it out completely, no. Thank Doctor. No further questions. Daniel called Detective Sarah Vance to the stand. She described the crime scene, the investigation, and the inconsistencies in Julian's story. She explained the timeline, noting that Julian had claimed he arrived at 6:30, but a neighbor's security camera showed his car pulling into the Hayes driveway at 6:10, 20 minutes earlier than he had stated. Detective, why is this discrepancy significant? It suggests the defendant was not being truthful about his timeline. If he lied about when he arrived, what else was he lying about? Robert's cross-examination focused on the lack of physical evidence. Detective Vance, did you find any of my client's fingerprints on the victim's neck? No. Any of his deoxyribonucleic acid under the victim's fingernails? No. Any witnesses who saw my client push the victim down the stairs? No. So all you have is speculation. Sarah held his gaze. All we have is evidence, Mr. Caldwell. Evidence that your client is lying. The trial moved into its second week. Julian's private tutor, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Wright, was called by the defense. She testified that Julian was a model student, respectful and kind. Julian has always been exceptionally mature for his age. He's thoughtful, considerate, and deeply moral. I cannot imagine him harming anyone. As Dr. Wright spoke, Julian turned his head slightly and winked at a young woman in the gallery, a classmate from Crestview Academy. The gesture was quick, but Sarah, seated behind the prosecution table, saw it. She made a note. When Dr. Wright finished, Julian leaned over to Robert and whispered loudly enough that the jury could hear, "This is a waste of taxpayer money." Several jurors frowned. The prosecution called the 911 dispatcher who had taken Julian's call. The recording was played for the jury. Julian's voice came through the speakers, steady and calm. 911, what's your emergency? My friend fell down the stairs. He's not breathing. I need an ambulance. Okay, sir, stay calm. What's the address? Julian provided the address, his voice never wavering, never breaking. Are you able to perform CPR? I don't think it will help. His neck is broken. The dispatcher noted that Julian sounded unusually calm, almost clinical, describing his best friend's death. Daniel questioned the significance of this. In your experience, how do people typically sound when calling about a loved one's death? They're usually panicked, crying, incoherent. This caller was none of those things. The evidence mounted day by day. A neighbor testified that she had seen Julian's car at the Hayes residence earlier than he claimed. A biomechanics expert analyzed the trajectory of Leo's fall and concluded that for him to land in the position he did, he would have needed to be propelled with significant force, not simply trip. Dr. Ramirez, can you explain your conclusion? The expert, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair, used a diagram to illustrate. Based on the position of the body, the angle of impact, and the injuries sustained, I calculated that the victim was moving at a velocity inconsistent with a simple trip. Someone pushed him, or threw him, with considerable force. Robert challenged her methodology, but she held firm. Julian's facade began to crack. He stopped smiling at the cameras. He started tapping his pen against the table, a rapid staccato that echoed through the courtroom. Judge Sterling had to tell him to stop twice. In the prosecution's strategy sessions, held each evening in Daniel's office, the team reviewed the day's testimony and planned the next day's witnesses. Daniel sat at the head of the table, flanked by Sarah and his second chair, a young prosecutor named Lisa Tran. "We're building a strong circumstantial case," Lisa said, "but we need something definitive, something that puts him at the scene with intent." Daniel nodded. "We have it. The digital forensics report came back this morning. They recovered data from Julian's laptop. The factory reset missed a shadow cache. We have his search history." Sarah leaned forward. What was he searching for? Daniel slid a folder across the table. "See for yourself." Sarah opened it and read the first page. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God." "Exactly," Daniel said. "This is the smoking gun." The defense had its own struggles. Robert Caldwell sat in his office late at night, reviewing the evidence against his client. Julian had been adamant that the trial was a formality, that his intelligence and his family's resources would ensure an acquittal. But Robert was not so sure. The circumstantial evidence was piling up, and Julian's courtroom behavior was not helping. Robert had tried to coach him. "You need to look remorseful. You need to appear affected by this. The jury is watching you." Julian had waved him off. "I am affected, but I'm not going to put on a show. I'm not some blubbering idiot. I'm maintaining my composure, which is what any rational person would do." "Julian, the jury doesn't want to see composure. They want to see grief." "Then the jury is emotional and irrational, which is exactly why this whole system is flawed." Robert had wanted to strangle him. On the 15th day of trial, Daniel stood before Judge Sterling. "Your Honor, the people call Special Agent Thomas Brennan of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Cybercrimes Division." A murmur went through the courtroom. This was unexpected. Robert stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor!" This witness was not on the prosecution's witness list. "He was added 48 hours ago, Your Honor," Daniel replied. Well within the rules, the defense was provided with his report. Judge Sterling consulted her notes. "The objection is overruled. Proceed." Special Agent Brennan took the stand. He was a man in his early 40s, with close-cropped hair and the bearing of someone who had served in the military. He wore a dark suit and spoke with calm authority. Daniel approached. "Agent Brennan, can you explain your area of expertise?" "I specialize in digital forensics, specifically the recovery of deleted or encrypted data from electronic devices." "Were you asked to examine a laptop in connection with this case?" "Yes, a MacBook Pro, school-issued to the defendant, Julian Vane." "What was the condition of the laptop when you received it?" "It had been factory reset. All user data appeared to have been erased." "Were you able to recover any data?" "Yes, a factory reset deletes the pointers to data, but the actual data remains on the hard drive until it's overwritten. Using specialized software, I was able to recover a significant portion of the deleted files, including browser history, search logs, and cached web pages." Daniel paused, letting the significance of this sink in. Julian, at the defense table, had gone very still. "Agent Brennan, what did you find in the recovered data?" "I found extensive internet search activity from the week preceding the victim's death. The searches were highly specific and deeply concerning." "Your Honor," Daniel said, "at this time, the people would like to present Exhibit 42B, the shadow search log." Judge Sterling nodded. "Admitted." A screen descended from the ceiling. The lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly. Daniel clicked a remote, and the first image appeared. It was a screenshot of a browser search bar. The search term read, "How much insulin causes a fatal seizure?" The courtroom went silent. Julian's face turned pale. Daniel clicked to the next image. The search term read, "Cleanest way to snap a neck from behind." Several jurors gasped. One woman in the front row brought her hand to her mouth. Daniel clicked again, and again. Each search term was more damning than the last. Best grip for neck snap. How to make a push look like a trip. Average force required to break cervical spine. Time of death calculation after neck injury. The images kept coming. 14 pages of searches, each one methodical, each one researched with the precision of a student preparing for an exam. Julian had not just planned to kill Leo, he had studied how to do it. Daniel let the final image linger on the screen. The search term read, "How to act grieving after killing a friend." The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped and whispered. Reporters typed frantically on their phones. Leo's mother sobbed loudly, her husband holding her as she collapsed against him. At the defense table, Julian's hands were trembling. He reached for his water glass, trying to take a sip, but his hands shook so violently that the glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the table and shattered, water spreading across the wood surface and dripping onto the floor. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Robert Caldwell sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders slumped. He knew it was over. Daniel turned to Agent Brennan. "Can you verify the authenticity of these searches?" "Yes. Each search is timestamped with metadata showing the exact date and time it was performed. The searches were conducted on January 13th and 14th, 2 days and 1 day before the victim's death. The IP address traces back to the Vane residence. The device fingerprint matches the defendant's laptop. There is no doubt these searches were performed by Julian Vane." "And is there any way these searches could have been fabricated or planted?" "No. The data was recovered from the deep cache of the hard drive. It cannot be altered or faked. These searches are authentic." Daniel turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, Julian Vane searched for how to kill someone. He researched the specific method he would use. He looked up how to make it appear accidental. And then, 48 hours later, his best friend died in exactly the manner he had researched. This is not a coincidence. This is premeditated murder." Robert's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. "Agent Brennan, is it possible someone else used my client's laptop?" "The laptop requires a password to access. Only the defendant knew that password." "Could the laptop have been hacked?" "There's no evidence of any unauthorized access." Robert sat down, defeated. The courtroom remained in stunned silence as Agent Brennan was excused. Julian sat at the defense table, no longer the confident genius who had corrected the judge's Latin. He was pale, shaking. His eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape that did not exist. Daniel called his final witness, the neighbor whose Ring doorbell camera had captured Julian arriving at the Hayes residence. The footage was played. The timestamp showed 6:10 p.m., not 6:30 as Julian had claimed. But more damning was what happened next. The camera, motion activated, had also captured Julian leaving. He exited the house at 7:43 p.m., got into his car, sat there for 3 minutes, then pulled out his phone. The timestamp on his 911 call was 7:46 p.m. "Why would someone wait 3 minutes before calling for help?" Daniel asked the jury in his closing argument. I'll tell you why. Because he was composing himself. Because he was getting into character. Because he was preparing to perform the role of the grieving friend, exactly as he had researched. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood. On the charge of first-degree premeditated murder with depraved indifference, we find the defendant, Julian Alexander Vane, guilty. Julian made a sound like air being let out of a tire. His body seemed to collapse in on itself. Judge Sterling set sentencing for 1 week later. The sentencing hearing was held on a cold morning in early March. The courtroom was once again packed. Julian was brought in wearing the orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles shackled. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the past week. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. Before the judge imposed sentence, she allowed victim impact statements. Leo's father, David Hayes, walked slowly to the podium. He carried no notes. He simply stood there and stared at Julian for 3 full minutes. The silence was agonizing. Julian tried to meet his eyes, but could not. He looked down at the table, his shoulders shaking. Finally, David spoke. "I have nothing to say to you. You don't deserve my words." He walked back to his seat. Leo's mother was too overcome to speak. She remained in her seat, weeping. Judge Sterling looked down at Julian. "Stand up, Mr. Vane." Julian stood, barely able to support his own weight. The bailiff had to steady him. Judge Sterling began to speak, and her voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority. "Julian Alexander Vane, this court has witnessed your performance for weeks. We saw you correct my pronunciation of a Latin term during your arraignment, as if this courtroom were a classroom and you were the professor. We saw you wink at your friends in the gallery while witnesses described your victims' injuries. We saw you whisper dismissively about wasting taxpayer money while the people of this state sought justice for a murdered boy. We saw your smirks, your condescension, your insufferable belief that you were the smartest person in this room." She paused, letting her words settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. "But you were not smart enough to hide your darkness. You were not smart enough to understand that a factory reset does not erase everything. You were not smart enough to realize that your intellectual arrogance would be your downfall." Julian's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. He swayed slightly on his feet. The evidence presented at trial painted a picture of calculated evil. You researched how to kill another human being with the same diligence you would apply to a school project. You made lists. You studied techniques. You looked up how much force would be required to break someone's neck. You planned the timeline. You planned the cover story. You even researched how to act grieving afterward, as if grief were a performance you could master through study. Judge Sterling's voice hardened. "And then you executed your plan. You lured Leo Hayes, your supposed best friend, to his home under the pretense of keeping him company. You waited for the right moment, and then you killed him. You used the techniques you had researched. You applied the force you had calculated. You broke his neck, exactly as you had planned." Julian began to hyperventilate, his hands clutched at the table edge. "After you killed him, you waited. You sat in your car for 3 minutes, composing yourself, getting into character. Then you called 911 and delivered your lines with perfect calm. The grieving friend who had witnessed a tragic accident. It was a performance, Julian. Everything about you is a performance, but the mask has been ripped away. The judge leaned forward, her eyes boring into Julian. You thought you were untouchable. You thought your intelligence made you superior to the rules that govern the rest of us. You thought you could outwit the police, outwit this court, outwit justice itself. But you were wrong. Your intelligence did not save you. It condemned you. Because you used your gifts not to build something, not to help others, not to make the world better, but to destroy. You used your intellect to become a killer. Julian was crying now, tears streaming down his face, his breath coming in gasping sobs. The God complex was gone. The arrogance was extinguished. In its place was a terrified child who had finally realized the enormity of what he had done. Leo Hayes was 17 years old. He wanted to be a doctor. He volunteered at animal shelters. He was loved by his family and his friends. He had a future stretching out before him, full of possibility and promise. And you took all of that away. You took his life because you were jealous of his scholarship, because you could not tolerate that someone else might be better than you at something. Your ego was so fragile that you murdered your best friend, rather than accept that you were not the absolute best. Judge Sterling picked up the sentencing document. The law allows me to sentence you as an adult due to the premeditated nature of this crime and your age at the time of the offense. You will be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your natural life behind bars. You will never attend Princeton. You will never become whatever it was you thought you would become. You will age and die in a cell, and the world will forget you existed. Julian collapsed into his chair, his body racked with sobs. He was no longer the composed genius. He was a broken child, destroyed by his own arrogance. Judge Sterling was not finished. I want you to understand something, Julian. You spent hours researching how to commit this crime. You spent time learning how to kill, how to cover your tracks, how to perform grief. I suggest you now spend your time searching for something else. Search for how to live with yourself. Search for how to find meaning in a life spent in a cage. Search for how to develop the empathy and humanity you so clearly lack, because you will have nothing but time to search. She brought her gavel down. This court is adjourned. The bailiffs moved to take Julian away. He could barely walk. They had to support him under his arms as they led him toward the door. As he passed the media pool, he turned his face away, hiding from the cameras that had once been his allies. The same cameras that had captured his confident smile now captured his complete destruction. The aftermath unfolded over the following months. Crestview Academy implemented a new digital ethics program, teaching students about the permanence of online activity and the moral responsibility that comes with knowledge. Leo's parents established a scholarship in his name for students pursuing medical careers with a focus on compassion and service. Julian's parents released a brief statement expressing their sorrow for the Hayes family and their shock at their son's actions. They sold their Westchester estate and moved to another state, trying to escape the infamy. Julian was transferred to a maximum security prison in upstate New York. He was placed in protective custody, separated from the general population, after receiving threats from other inmates. He spent 23 hours a day in his cell, alone with his thoughts and his guilt. In his cell, Julian had access to books and educational materials. Prison officials noted that he spent hours each day reading, but he no longer read about science or history or literature. He read philosophy, ethics, religion. He was searching, just as the judge had suggested, for a way to understand what he had become. A prison counselor who met with Julian wrote in her notes, "The inmate demonstrates significant intellectual capacity, but profound emotional underdevelopment. He has begun to grasp the magnitude of his crime, but struggles to process genuine remorse. He refers frequently to the judge's statement that he used his intelligence for evil. He appears to be attempting to reconstruct his identity around a framework of penance rather than superiority. Progress is slow, but observable." 5 years later, Julian requested a meeting with Leo's parents. He wanted to apologize. David and Rebecca Hayes declined. They released a statement through their lawyer. "We have no interest in Julian Vane's journey toward redemption. Our son is still dead. No apology will change that." The digital forensics evidence from Julian's case became a teaching tool in law enforcement academies across the country. The shadow search log, as it came to be known, was used to demonstrate how digital footprints persist even after deletion, and how criminal intent can be documented through search history. In the evidence room of the Westchester County Courthouse, Julian's laptop sits in a sealed box, tagged and catalogued. The screen is dark, but the data remains, preserved forever as a record of premeditated evil. The search terms, the timestamps, the careful planning, all locked in silicon and storage. A digital confession that destroyed a killer's performance. Detective Sarah Vance retired 3 years after the trial. In her final interview with a local newspaper, she reflected on the case. "Julian Vane thought he was smarter than everyone else, but intelligence without conscience is just a tool for destruction. The saddest part is that he could have done so much good with his gifts. Instead, he chose evil. And now, he has a lifetime to regret that choice." Daniel Martinez continued as a prosecutor and went on to try 17 more murder cases. He won them all. But when asked about his most memorable case, he always mentioned Julian Vane. "It was the most clear-cut example of premeditation I've ever seen. The defendant literally wrote out instructions for how to commit murder. It was chilling, but it was also a reminder that justice works. The truth always comes out." Judge Catherine Sterling served another 8 years on the bench before retiring. She never spoke publicly about individual cases, but colleagues noted that she kept a small framed photograph in her chambers. It was of Leo Hayes, smiling, taken from his high school yearbook. A reminder of why the work mattered. In the maximum security prison, Julian turned 32. He had spent 15 years behind bars. His hair had started to grey, his face had hardened. The brilliant teenager who had walked into court with such confidence was gone, replaced by a middle-aged man who understood, finally and completely, what he had lost. On the anniversary of Leo's death each year, Julia beyond the day in silence. He did not eat, he did not read. He simply sat in his cell and thought about the boy he had killed and the man he might have been if he had chosen differently. The legacy of the case endured. Law students studied it. Prosecutors referenced it. Parents used it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked arrogance in gifted children. And in Crestview Heights, Leo Hayes was remembered not as a victim, but as a young man full of promise, whose life mattered. The last word, as always, belonged to justice. Julian Alexander Vane, the boy who thought he was smarter than the law, spent the rest of his life proving that he was not. The performance was over. The mask was shattered. And the truth, preserved in digital code and courtroom testimony, remained unchangeable and absolute. In his cell, late at night, Julian sometimes whispered the words Judge Sterling had spoken. "You used your intellect to become a killer." And in the darkness, with no one to perform for and nowhere to hide, he finally understood that she was right.